Matters of the day, oral questions put by members to ministers. The time now is on the better side of 3:14, and we will finish at 4:44. I will now recognize the honourable member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the CBRM Mayor and Council, Island MLAs and MPs, and many residents were encouraged by the commitment from the provincial government to support the municipality with 25 cents for every federal dollar allocated for the CBRM capital plan. While this is a great starting point, Mr. Speaker, we would like the province to clarify their commitment to our capital plan. As indicated by the CBRM, if the province matches our municipality's investment, we could begin to see the benefits of this plan in this current fiscal year. So my question, can the Premier confirm that his government will match the investment which has already been committed by the CBRM in this current fiscal year?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I was pleased to meet with the Mayor and members of the CBRM Council and to review their capital plan today. I reiterated the commitment that we have already made. They asked me about whether or not, if money was to come forward in this year. I indicated to them that I would be happy to consider that if it happens. We want to encourage the federal investment in the province, and certainly we would encourage the effective use of our money to trigger larger investments in CBRM, or for that matter, in other parts of the province.
The honourable member for Glace Bay on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Cape Breton's employment numbers are certainly alarming. 18.6% unemployment and climbing, Mr. Speaker. The highest unemployment in any city in Atlantic Canada, in Sydney. Out-migration of thousands of families over the last number of years, and ownership of $454 million in wastewater improvements in the next decade, a cost that we simply can't afford, Mr. Speaker. This plan will keep families home. It will put tradespeople back to work, and it will grow the Cape Breton economy, which has certainly experienced negative growth for a number of years. Mr. Speaker, plain and simple, our municipality needs this. So, to clarify again for the Premier, if the federal government commits to the CBRM capital plan, will the Premier live up to his commitment for the 2013-2014 fiscal year?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I've already said that we're prepared to consider the request from CBRM. We have a capital plan in place. What I told them was that we would be prepared to go back and reconsider the capital plan if money was available, because we want to make use of any investment that would come from the federal government, and we're happy to do that. I also explained that that capital planning for the province takes place in the fall, so that they would know for future years that this is the best way to prepare for budgeting. But Mr. Speaker, I also indicated to them that what would very much be important to the CBRM are investments, good investments in jobs, like IIBG, like the Maritime Link, which would be very beneficial to the people of Cape Breton. So maybe the next time the member from Glace Bay stands up, maybe he can say whether or not he would support those investments.
The honourable member for Glace Bay on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the CBRM capital plan, the CBRM has constructed a real plan for the economy in Cape Breton. This plan will address the crumbling infrastructure, get hundreds of Cape Breton tradespeople back to work, and provide a much-needed injection to the local economy, and indeed the economy of the entire province. This also has potential to bridge the gap to new opportunities related to port initiatives, natural resource development, and tourism expansion. But for this to succeed, the Premier needs to ensure that the capital plan is presented to the federal government as a provincial priority, one that the entire province can get behind, Mr. Speaker. So my question, will the Premier confirm in this House right now that he's willing to put the plan forward to the federal government as a provincial priority for the province of Nova Scotia?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I will confirm that I have agreed with the Mayor of CBRM to work with him on this project. We're prepared to do that. We've said it over and over again. We've reiterated in letters. I've answered this here before. My hope, though, is that on the wider question associated with economic development, the member opposite and the members opposite, for that matter, will recognize the kinds of investments that are necessary by government in business in order to ensure ensure that there's real economic development and growth in areas like Cape Breton, and understand that when we make commitments, whether it's to companies like IBG or to the Maritime Link or to Port Hawkesbury paper, they are important for the growth of the economy in that region.
The honourable member for Cape Breton North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the CBRM capital plan addresses much-needed projects and community infrastructure. Cape Breton has been hit hard by unemployment, out-migration, and the CBRM has a plan to breathe new life into crumbling capital and local infrastructure. The reality is that the potential of this new capital plan is contingent on a commitment from the province. My question to the Minister of Service Nova Scotia: does the province currently have the money they've promised for CBRM? Crews in Cape Breton are shovel-ready and waiting to go.
The Honourable Minister of Service Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I got to say, I'm not sure why the opposition doesn't understand that yes means yes. We indicated.
Order. The Honourable Minister of Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, we may not spend 5 cents. It depends on the feds. The letter that I sent to the mayor and council was that we were in for 25 cents on the dollar, based or contingent on the federal government coming forward with their money, and so that's what I signed my name to. That's what I stand behind.
The honourable member for Cape Breton North on his first supplementary.
So, Mr. Speaker, the CBRM needs absolute clarity on the province's commitment to $75 million over this 5 years. We cannot afford to be given any more half-hearted conditional promises by the NDP government. So I think what I'm hearing, Mr. Speaker, is will the minister give us unconditional commitment that the government is on board and this is a provincial priority?
The Honourable Minister of Service Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Yeah, look, Mr. Speaker, I signed my name to a piece of paper that said we were committed, and that we were committed on the basis of the federal government coming forward with their money, and I mean their money in a reasonable time. In other words, we're not going to carry the load on this funding and in 3 years or 5 years they finally backfill it with some federal money. So we want a real clear commitment of their money and when it's going to be available, and when we know that, then we'll make our money available. The members opposite may want to read my correspondence. The mayor had copies of it this morning at breakfast. I think he took it to each of the caucuses. I think it's quite clear what I signed, and I stand behind what I signed, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton North on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, after ripping up the MOU with the municipalities know how much to rely on that signature, Mr. Speaker. The truth, Mr. Speaker, is the past treatment of Cape Breton by this government gives the people of the island reason to be wary of their commitments. Without an absolute guarantee that the province will provide the money, the situation starts to look more like what the government did in Yarmouth. By cutting the ferry that devastated the community of Nova Scotia and the entire region. We hope the government has learned from this mistake. So my question is, will the minister immediately conclude an agreement with CBRM so they can become a model of job creation and long-term planning for other similar municipalities to follow?
The Honourable Minister of Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations. Order, please. That'll be enough for this afternoon on all sides of the House. Okay. The Honourable Minister of Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, my signature wasn't on the MOU. So, and if the members opposite want to check the MOU, they'll find the signature that was on it, which has a former Tory minister's signature. and the page with the signatures had a clause in it that the government could move away based on its ability to fund it. So the members opposite may not like it, but they signed it, Mr. Speaker. So I reiterate to the member who asked the question that I stand behind my signature on the letter that I sent to the Mayor and Council. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In a recent TV appearance, Mr. Speaker, when asked about cyberbullying, the Premier responded, and I quote, "In order for people to take this seriously, there has to be a criminal sanction," end of quote. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Education's appointed task force on cyberbullying submitted its recommendations to government in February of 2012. In recommendation 44 states, and I quote, "It is recommended that the Provincial Minister of Justice make representation to the Federal Minister of Justice about evaluating the effectiveness of the current criminal code provisions in responding to bullying and cyberbullying, and explore the pros and cons of a distinct crime of bullying and cyberbullying," end of quote. So my question to the Premier, why did the government not take this recommendation seriously when it was brought to his government a full 14 months ago?
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In fact, we took all of the recommendations seriously. They are the basins of the action plan that we have moved forward with since then. In fact, the Minister of Justice is the co-chair of the Federal Provincial Territorial Working Group on Cybercrime. They are working very specifically on these kinds of provisions. I understand from my conversation yesterday with the Prime Minister that he will be consulting with that working group and are looking for language around the kind of legislation, the kind of reforms that we are seeking with the criminal code.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the conversation that the Minister of Justice is having today, Mr. Speaker, the committee that was struck by the Minister of Education 14 months ago recommended that the province start that conversation 14 months ago, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the Law Amendments Committee, Mr. Speaker, we heard from Pam Murchison, a mother who lost her daughter as a result of the cruelty of cyberbullying on May 3rd, 2012. She was bringing her daughter's issue to the forefront and pleaded with the committee to accept recommendation number 44. So again, my question to the Premier, why didn't the Premier act earlier, and why didn't the Premier act to protect our kids at the first opportunity instead of waiting 14 months?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition is simply misinformed. The reality is that task force has been in place now for some time. As I said, not only are we participating in it, the Minister of Justice is one of the co-chairs. They're the ones who are bringing forward recommendations, and they're examining these issues. We're obviously an important part of that committee, and of course we're committed to that. I made very clear our intentions yesterday with the Prime Minister, but that is only the latest, of course, in a long string of representations that we've made on this matter.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
What we know for sure is that recommendation number 4 was defeated by the NDP government on law amendments, Mr. Speaker, on April 2012 and in October 2012, Mr. Speaker. Those are the facts, Mr. Speaker. And what their own government's task force asked for was that this government start a conversation 14 months ago with the federal government, Mr. Speaker. Not only did they sit on the recommendation number 44, Mr. Speaker, but recommendation number 42 is, and I quote, "It is recommended that the Nova Scotia Department of Justice, the Nova Scotia Chief Civil Police Association, and Internet service providers work together to develop a protocol to facilitate police access to information during the investigation of bullying and cyberbullying," Mr. Speaker. So my question to the Premier, when can Nova Scotians expect this government to act on recommendation 44 and allow our police forces to have the tools they need to protect our children?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, it is particularly ironic that the critic for the opposition was both the Education Minister and the Health Minister, and in 10 years did absolutely nothing on bullying. Did absolutely nothing on bullying. And in 14 months, we have done more to move Nova Scotia into the leadership in this country on cyberbullying than they would have ever have dreamed of, Mr. Speaker. It is this government that is moving forward to ensure that we protect our young people. It is this government that is putting in place the educational standards, they're putting in place the supports in the healthcare system to help our young people, Mr. Speaker. I know that out there parents will not give way to the cynicism and the negativity of the opposition.
The honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we all know, the power of educating our youngest citizens is key to economic success. But what we don't oftentimes link is the power that education has when it comes to saving lives. Mr. Speaker, the world has changed. The prevalence of prescription drugs has piqued the curiosity of our youngest citizens and is playing havoc with the lives of our young people. Unfortunately, we're hearing more and more about the tragic outcomes associated with prescription drugs, when time after time we hear the countless stories of lives that are ending far too soon. Could the Minister of Health and Wellness outline what role he plays to ensure drug education in our schools remains relevant and is incorporated into the school curriculum?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to the member opposite for bringing this question forward. I know all members in the House are disturbed when we hear cases of prescription drugs and death of abuse of prescription drug, Mr. Speaker. It's as a father, and I know almost everybody in here as a parent couldn't imagine having to go through that ordeal. As Minister of Health, I've worked with many partners throughout different departments, but outside partners. I know Captain or Chief Mander from the Valley, for example. After becoming Minister of Health, I've requested a meeting with him. We sat down to make sure that we're working together and moving forward to make sure that everybody who can make a difference in preventing one death, we do all that we can do. So we had a rigorous TV campaign around awareness. I think that's one of the key things we need to ensure is to educate our young people on the importance of the dangers around prescription drug abuse, the mixing of alcohol and prescription drugs, Mr. Speaker. But I'm also working with our ministers, Minister of Education, on a number of programs that I hope will start that education at the earliest possible time. And of course, some of them is through the Schools Plus program that we have in place throughout the province. And I look forward to continue to work with ministers. I continue to work with partners in law enforcement and clinicians in the community to make sure that we do everything we can to prevent any deaths in the future.
The honourable member for Kings West on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, again last week, another family went public when Dale Gelado spoke of the tragic death of her daughter Olivia, passed away in April 2012. She was just 15 years old. A bright young junior high student in Dartmouth took one Dilaudid that was ultimately ruled some 9 months later to be the single cause of her death. Her parents spoke publicly for the need for more education around drug awareness, more so than ever at an earlier age. The Minister of Education explained to us what she has been doing to ensure that drug education remains relevant and incorporated into the school curriculum, especially at the upper elementary, middle and junior high grades.
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for bringing this very important topic to the floor today. This is a very serious problem that we're dealing with in Nova Scotia and other jurisdictions across Canada. I know that everything is being done in every department to raise awareness around the the dangers of prescription drugs. It is incorporated in our curriculum right from primary, teaching children about prescription drugs not being candy, for example. The very, very early education of keeping one safe from primary right through. I know that the member asked what was happening in our education system. It is incorporated from primary through to the junior high grades, through health. It is also incorporated in other areas, healthy living and in health. There is curriculum that addresses it at grade 9, and one of the things is that the prescription drug use continues to change. The drugs continue to change. So we are working with the health department and with the professionals in the health department to make sure that our education is relevant and up to date. And so we will continue to do that to make sure that the curriculum that we are offering our children bring the very best available resources so that we make sure that our children know not to use prescription drugs. Thank you.
The honourable member for Kings West on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure where to start with that response because in the junior high program there is one paragraph of outdated information. Mr. Speaker, interesting, the minister should say really all of this. I have a copy of an email sent to parents from a teacher in an elementary school in Dartmouth. In fact, this elementary school feeds into the same junior high that Olivia was attending. The email in part reads as follows, and I will table this. In health, we will be starting our unit on healthy self. The grade 6 outcomes have changed, and we no longer do a unit on drugs. However, we do still cover a few outcomes on sexual health. Mr. Speaker, the world is changing. This minister and this government refuses to believe it. This is unacceptable. Could the minister please explain to all members of the legislature why the grade 6 outcomes have changed so that our youngest citizens, the very students who are getting ready to enter junior high, are no longer receiving education on drugs and the lethal impacts that they have on their lives?
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We are working in our school system to raise awareness around the dangers of prescription drug use, especially when mixed with alcohol and not using other people's medications. I misspoke when I said teaching children not to use prescription drugs, but I meant was not using prescription drugs that are not their own or to mix them. Our school guidance counselors are working very closely with addiction services and also with our DHAs. We are making sure that there's information through our guidance counselors and through our curriculum, throughout our whole system. We are really very concerned about the prevalence of prescription drug misuse and abuse, and we will do everything that we can to make sure that the information that we provide our children is current, up to date, relevant, so that we can make sure that children are very aware not to misuse drugs. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Premier met with the Prime Minister about modernizing the Criminal Code of Canada to protect our kids against assault or sexual assault, or bullying, or the distribution of intimate pictures on the Internet. That is all good, Mr. Speaker, and we all support that. But there is also a role for the province to play in updating our provincial laws to protect children by way of early intervention and prevention before activities ever get to the criminal level. I asked the Premier, will he commit to updating Nova Scotia's laws by introducing and passing in this session of the legislature strong protective legislation for our kids?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, of course, in any legislative session there are additional pieces of legislation coming forward. We intend to do that with respect to this issue as well. What I can say, though, is that we're not going to limit the protection that we have just to children. The fact of the matter is that simply because a person passes out of their minority and into young adulthood does not mean that society should stop protecting them or their personal integrity. The simple matter of the fact is that people who are engaged in this kind of behavior and activity, they act maliciously, they act with the intent to harm people, and those kinds of activities ought to attract the appropriate sanction. in this country, where that appropriate sanction comes from is the Criminal Code of Canada. That's why I was in Ottawa yesterday to speak to the Prime Minister, and I'm happy to report to the Leader of the Conservative Party that he takes the same position.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank the Premier for that answer, and of course we take the same position, and no one is suggesting that protections for Canadian citizens or our fellow Nova Scotians should stop when they reach adult age, Mr. Speaker, but the fact of the matter is the Premier has gone to Ottawa, the Premier is pointing at the Criminal Code, but he is the Premier of Nova Scotia and has the power to strengthen and modernize Nova Scotia law as well, particularly to provide the tools that our law enforcement officials need, the prosecutors need, that school officials need to intervene in cases where they see bullying or cyberbullying in the modern age. Nova Scotians are waiting for someone to act, Mr. Speaker, and that's why I want to ask the Premier again, will he bring in meaningful, strong provincial legislation on bullying and cyberbullying and all that's associated with it here in Nova Scotia, introduce it and pass it in this session of the legislature?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we've already brought in legislation. As he would know from his time here in the House, we intend to continue with that. But as he would also know, we carry on these conversations with the federal government. We respect their jurisdiction and where that lies with them. We think they should act. We don't fill, as they say, fill the field that should be inhabited by the federal government. I've seen some of the suggestions that the Leader of the Conservative Party has made. I believe some of them are of a constructive nature. We have been considering them, along with all of the other input that we have received with respect to these matters, and shortly legislation will come forward. I want him to know that in many cases, what he's asking for is, in fact, already covered. The jurisdiction of the courts is a broad one in these matters, and judges are able to exercise this jurisdiction if they so choose. However, we are, of course, engaged in ensuring that the legislation that we introduce will be effective in terms of ensuring that we provide the best possible protection for whether it's children or adults.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Premier is considering an awful lot of things these days, but Nova Scotians want action. The federal government, faced with the same challenges across our whole country, is today committed to bringing forward amendments to the Criminal Code by June, the month after next. Mr. Speaker, he said that today in his meetings with Justice Ministers, including our provincial Justice Ministers. I'll get that for the Premier if he's unsure of what the federal government is committed to. The time for consideration has quickly come to an end, Mr. Speaker. The legislation that the Premier has brought forward up to this point is inadequate. Nova Scotians want strong, real action to give all officials involved the ability to intervene and prevent bullying from happening when they see it, not just to count it and study it as the Premier's bill has done. They want more, Mr. Speaker. This House of Assembly, at this time, this spring, is in session. Will he bring forward appropriate, strong, protective legislation this spring and pass it in the same speed that the Government of Canada is moving on to protect people at the national level?
The Honourable the Premier.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I already indicated, we intend to bring forward additional legislation in case there is any doubt that needs to be clarified. But, of course, as you would know, Mr. Speaker, the passage of any bill through this House and the speed with which that can happen is actually dependent on the cooperation of the opposition.
The Honourable Member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday I asked the Minister of Justice about why our justice system failed the victims of abuse in the Fenwick-McIntosh case and why it failed all Nova Scotians. I asked the Minister if he would order an independent inquiry into these matters, and the Minister flatly refused. The Premier, based on his previous career, knows full well that something went horribly wrong in the administration of our justice system in the way this case has been handled. Since the Justice Minister is refusing to order an independent inquiry into the events around the McIntosh case, Will the Premier of Nova Scotia reconsider his minister's misguided refusal and order an independent investigation into this matter?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I'll just correct the member for Richmond. The minister did not refuse. In fact, he pointed out, I believe, to the House that there is already an internal review that is underway. I understand today in Ottawa, one of the colleagues of the member for Richmond actually asked for a federal inquiry into this matter, and for good reason, Mr. Speaker, because it appears that over the period that this thing was under consideration, this case was under consideration, there was some 14 years where twice the federal government, through their officials, went ahead and issued passports to Mr. McIntosh, despite the fact that there was an outstanding warrant for his arrest. So this, of course, warrants investigation. This is not something, of course, that happened during our time in government. In fact, federally, I believe the Liberals were in power. Indeed, provincially, during some of that time, the Liberals would have been in power. But you know, like a lot of other things, you know, we have inherited. We have inherited, you know, these issues, and I want to assure the member that if an inquiry takes place, it should be led by the federal government, and if it is, of course, we would participate.
The honourable member for Richmond on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier knows, and I've acknowledged already, that the federal government has a role in this. There's no question. But the investigation started in Nova Scotia. And the question is, why did investigators in Nova Scotia take so long and not push this matter further? Second, once Mr. McIntosh finally arrived back in the country, it took the Public Prosecution Service of Nova Scotia, and the Premier, being a lawyer, knows that right away there was concerns with the delays, that he was going to argue that this wasn't brought in a timely manner. It took 3 full years for the Public Prosecution Service to even walk through the doors of a courtroom with this case. That is clearly unacceptable, and it calls out for answers as to what went wrong in that matter. So rather than make these victims wait any longer, even if it was not this government that was in power when this happened, will it not show leadership on behalf of the victims and on behalf of all Nova Scotians and order an independent investigation as to what went wrong in Nova Scotia regarding the Fenwick-McIntosh case?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't actually disagree with much of what the leader or the member for. I was giving him a promotion. The member for Richmond. The member for Richmond has said the Fenwick-McIntosh case is a deeply disturbing case, and why it is that it took as long as it took to get to where it should have, regardless of whether or not the prosecution service was issuing warrants for arrest and all of the other things it's done, I believe does need to be reviewed. There is an internal review going on now. We know that there is a federal responsibility with respect to this. I want to see the end of the internal review. If that does not produce the appropriate results where we can understand what happened, then I am certainly open to a further independent review. I would like to see one that would also take into account the delays that took place or the actions that took place on behalf of the federal government as well. It would be my desire that if this matter is going to be looked at, that it's looked at comprehensively, that of course the questions associated with the prosecution service here in Nova Scotia are looked at, but surely to goodness we also have to look at what happened that led to these delays from the federal perspective as well.
The honourable member for Richmond on his final supplementary.
Again, Mr. Speaker, there's no one else that would like to see that than myself, that both levels would be looked at the same time. I don't think anyone's advocating to have 2 separate independent inquiries take place. It would be the preference that there be one. But unfortunately, we have a division of powers at play here. And what the federal government will do is outside of our control here in this legislature. But we know what our province can do. These victims have waited long enough, Mr. Premier. You recognize that. Why it took 3 years for the Public Prosecution Service to even get this to court once he was here has to be answered. The victims deserve no less. We asked in December of 2011, when the Court of Appeal threw out these charges, for the Minister to undertake a review. He refused. So here we are waiting again. If the Premier is not prepared to call a full independent inquiry now, will he at least today publicly commit to disclose the findings of the review taking place in the Public Prosecution Service?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'm certainly willing to take advice with respect to releasing information of the review. I would want to know whether or not there are any legal impediments to that, but I'm certainly prepared to consider it. Further, I want to inform the member for Richmond that today in Ottawa, the Minister of Justice is meeting with his federal counterpart, and he is requesting of his federal counterpart a full inquiry into this matter.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, a few moments ago, the Premier said that what Cape Breton really needs is private investment and more jobs. That's true, Mr. Speaker, and now he has his chance, because Sydney is in the running for an $800 million iron ore pellet plant, which comes with 700 good private sector, well-paying jobs, Mr. Speaker, but they're competing with Sept-Îles, Quebec for those same jobs. Sydney has a lot going for it. It has a better workforce, has a better port, it's got a better location on our planet for trade and for the bringing in of supplies and materials. But because of this government, Mr. Speaker, Sydney has one other thing to consider, and that is that they pay the highest power rates in all of Canada, something that is important to actually attracting good jobs, Mr. Speaker. Sydney is being forced to compete with one hand tied behind their backs, the highest power rates in all of Canada. So will the Premier, in the interest of attracting those jobs that he talks about, agree to rip up his expensive power plan, freeze power rates, and help get Cape Breton attract the jobs that he says he wants them to have?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure I'm not the only one who can't believe the audacity of the Leader of the Conservative Party, the party that created the power rates of today, the party that privatized Nova Scotia Power, the party that tied us to expensive fossil fuel-driven electricity. Mr. Speaker, if anything, the Leader of the Conservative Party, the next time he stands up, should apologize to Nova Scotians for forcing communities to compete with one hand tied behind their back.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Speaker, I want every Nova Scotian to look at their power bill this month, because they will see it is orange, and the reason it is orange is because today's power prices are all the responsibility of the current government and the current Premier. That's what Cape Breton is up against, Mr. Speaker. 1,800 jobs lost under this government since they came in, Mr. Speaker. But what we don't know, on top of those jobs that are lost, is how many are not coming here at all, because places like Sydney are competing with one hand tied behind their back for new jobs and investments. So will the Premier who watches and receives those orange power bills every month coming from Nova Scotia, will he freeze power rates and give Sydney a chance to win those jobs?
The Premier.
Mr. Speaker, when they look at their power bills, what they see is a reflection of 10 years of mismanagement of this by the Conservative government, and then an additional 7 years of mismanagement by the previous Liberal government, Mr. Speaker. You know, finally, the people of Nova Scotia have a government that understand energy policy, understand that in order to have stable long-term rates, we have to get off of fossil fuels, that we have to move to renewables that will provide us with good long-term stable rates for business, something that they can depend on. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, I would go so far as to say, no doubt, one of the advantages that companies like IBG are looking forward to would be the establishment of the Maritime Link and its ability to be able to get access to power, which incidentally will come ashore in Cape Breton.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, when our power rates have gone up 30% in 4 years, when they are 15% above the national average and now the highest in Canada, when the unemployment rate in Cape Breton Island is 18.5%, and when 18,000 Nova Scotians moved away last year, the mismanagement is his and his government's and nobody else's. Those are the facts, Mr. Speaker. Now they have a chance for 700 jobs, real, good, private, good-paying, long-term jobs. Will the Premier freeze power rates and give Cape Breton and Sydney a chance to win those jobs?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, the Conservative Party of Nova Scotia created the economic despair that we see in Nova Scotia today. It has been difficult, Mr. Speaker, to get past the $1.4 billion deficit that they left behind. It has been difficult, Mr. Speaker, to get past the pathetic record that they had with respect to economic development, the worst in the country year after year after year, Mr. Speaker. But here, Mr. Speaker, is a government that is turning the corner to a brighter future for Nova Scotians. And as to power rates, Mr. Speaker, what I want the Leader of the Conservative Party to know is this. We're not going to freeze power rates. We put power rates down 10% when we took the when we took the HST off of home electricity, something that the Conservative Party voted against.
The Honourable Member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, 2 years ago this month, the Premier made a commitment to the families of autistic children from one end of the province to the other. Premier committed to doubling funding for EIBI from its 2005-06 level of $4 million to $8 million, so that, in the words of the Premier, children living with autism should have access to the best treatment as early as possible to give them the best chance for success now and in the future. Mr. Speaker, I will table the Premier's speech. In 2011-12, funding increased for EIBI by $2 million, and a funding amount of $6 million remained unchanged in last year's budget. Last evening, the Minister of Health and Wellness confirmed funding for the 2013-14 year now stands at $4.1 million. Could the Premier please explain why he has failed to double the EIBI budget like he promised families and children he would do back in 2011?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we're very proud of the fact that instead of leaving what was in place where EIBI funding meant that there was simply a lottery where some kids got access to the services that they needed and others did not, we are committed to ensuring that all children get access to these services. That's what the budget does, Mr. Speaker. In addition to EIBI, we of course put in place a range of other supports that also support children on the autism spectrum. We're very proud of this, Mr. Speaker. I believe that parents are very happy with this. There's always more to do. And, of course, we intend to do more. But we have, under very difficult circumstances, kept our commitments and ensured that children today get the services that they need.
The Honourable Member for Kings West on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier and this government made a commitment to children with autism and their families before the end of their mandate, and they have broken this promise. Mr. Speaker, the Premier indicated 2 years ago that every preschool child in Nova Scotia who needs the EIBI program for more than 1 year would get it. Perhaps, Mr. Speaker, this government's agenda is such that if we slow down assessments, we can cut the treatment budget. Could the Premier explain how every preschool child in Nova Scotia who needs EIBI treatment will be able to get it when funding has been cut to 2005-2006 levels?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I think it's pathetic to have a member of this House stand up and actively try and mislead people in the province. You know, it is pathetic when parents who are dealing with questions associated with the health of their children are actively misled by a member of the legislature, Mr. Speaker. The budget for EIBI was $2 million. It's now $4 million, and we are ensuring that children who are on the autism spectrum are getting the support they need.
The honourable member for Kings West on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the reality is that this Premier did not keep the promise which said the EIBI program would move from $4 million to $8 million. It's right in the speech that I just tabled. That's exactly what was said. 2 years ago, this Premier made a grand announcement about EIBI support, and he has broken his word. He spoke about the unfairness of the lottery system for EIBI and how his government was going to fix it once and for all so no family would be denied. This Premier not only failed to fulfill his full commitment of doubling the EIBI budget to a full $8 million. He has cut the budget back to the 2005-06 level of $4 million. Mr. Speaker, obviously the Premier likes the flash of announcements, but when he thinks everyone's backs are turned, he decides it would be acceptable to balance the budget on the backs of autistic children and their families in this province. Mr. Speaker, the reality is children will wait from 2.5, 3 years after being diagnosed until they're 4 years old, get a little bit of help, not the entire EIBI program. If $4 million was insufficient to this government in 2011, why is it now all of a sudden adequate in 2013?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, you know, there are days in this House where I can't believe that a member of the House would try and prey on the parents of children who need services, Mr. Speaker. The reality is we made commitments. We made commitments to people which we stand by, which we keep. We ensure that the kids who need these services get them. Mr. Speaker, they have in their caucus a Minister of Health who, with respect to this, did absolutely nothing, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we are ensuring that there are appropriate services in place. We are living up to the commitments we made to those parents and to those kids, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, that caucus brought forward, Mr. Speaker, that caucus brought forward for us recommendations, for example, with respect to insulin pumps for kids, and then, Mr. Speaker, broke that commitment by voting against the very budget that implemented it. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question to you is for the Deputy Premier. We learned last week that unemployment in Cape Breton had soared to 18.6%, and I'll table the document to back that up. Statistics Canada shows that provincially, we have an unemployment to job ratio of 15:1, and I'll table that document. So, Mr. Speaker, it's obvious that with such high unemployment in Cape Breton, that the ratio at home would be much higher than the provincial average. So my question to the Minister is, will the Minister admit that their economic plan has been an absolute disaster for the people of Cape Breton?
The Honourable the Deputy Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll tell that member what's been a disaster, Mr. Speaker. The taking of the Service Canada jobs, Mr. Speaker. Taking out services for veterans, that's a disaster. Mail service in North Sydney, that's a disaster, Mr. Speaker. That's who ruined our economy, is that party over there, and they love their federal brothers that are doing it, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton West on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I'm surprised. All along I thought we were in the House of Assembly, not in the Parliament buildings of Canada. But I will say this, that it is true that he has created some jobs with the moving companies who are taking the people off of Cape Breton Island and moving them to other parts of Canada to work. Mr. Speaker, there are over 11,000, I repeat, 11,000 unemployed people in Cape Breton. Along with the jobs losses, people are also losing hope, Mr. Speaker. They're losing hope. Cape Breton's population has decreased by almost 4% in the last 4 years due to the hardships inflicted by this NDP government. So my question is this: will the minister admit that life is so tough in NDP-governed Cape Breton Island that hard-working people are being forced to leave their beautiful island?
Honourable the Deputy Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will agree with hard-working people are being forced to leave. It's because of his federal cousins, Mr. Speaker. They will not stand up and represent the people that elected them, Mr. Speaker. They will get up there.
Order, please. The Honourable Deputy Premier has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I must have struck a chord over there, Mr. Speaker. The fact is that they don't, when they are asked by the media, they distance themselves from their federal cousins. Oh, that's federal Tories. We're progressive conservatives, Mr. Speaker. They're all the same. They're all blue, and they will not do the true blue thing and look after Cape Breton. They look after conservatives first, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton West on his first final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. You know, Mr. Speaker, it's hard to believe that that member is actually from Cape Breton.
Blacked out the name.
The number of unemployed people has increased by almost 6% in the last 4 years in Cape Breton, Mr. Speaker. The NDP have created a perfect storm of high taxes, higher power rates, and no real plan for creating jobs. As a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, the NDP budget shows that there is no plan for creating jobs. The budget actually allows for a forecast with more job losses. Their own budget, Mr. Speaker. Will the minister finally admit that in order to get our economy running again, we need to cut taxes, stop wasteful spending, and start creating jobs?
The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, we've got the lowest business. Mr. Speaker, we've got the lowest business taxes, Mr. Speaker. You know what? I've been in this House now for going over 15 years, Mr. Speaker, and I remember one of the first things they did in the campaign, Mr. Speaker. One of the first things.
Go ahead.
One of the first things they did in a campaign, Mr. Speaker, and that they trotted in Metro here, they wouldn't dare bring it to Cape Breton, was close Cisco open hospital beds. Well, half of that was right, Mr. Speaker. They forsaken the steelworkers of Cape Breton, but didn't open any beds, Mr. Speaker. That's the type of group you're dealing with those guys.
The Honourable Member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there's an old saying, there's a story behind every number. For Nova Scotians waiting for orthopedic surgeries, there are unfortunately thousands of stories, so I will outline just one as I have her permission to do so. Carol Touton has been waiting for her orthopedic surgery for 18 months. In actual fact, due to a mix-up in the referral process, it's been 30 months. Despite placing herself on the cancellation list, her surgeon told her, expect to wait another 3 to 6 months. When you exclude the referral process, that's a wait of 2 years. When you incorporate the mix-up with the referral, Carol's wait time is almost 3 years. How is it acceptable that some 30 months later, Carol is still waiting for her orthopedic surgery? My question is to the Minister of Health.
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Access to the appropriate healthcare services is a priority for us. When we came into government, there was a mess within the finances of the province, but somewhat of a mess within the healthcare system. And I say that because the healthcare system wasn't sustainable. The money that we've seen, the growth in healthcare spending over the last number of years, leading into us coming into government, Mr. Speaker, was increasing exponentially. We had some of the highest increases in the country, but yet we continue to see wait times grow. So we've taken the approach that we tried to change models of care. We know that orthopedic surgeons have some of the longer wait lists have some of the longest wait lists within the surgery services here in the province, Mr. Speaker. I'm unaware of the mix-up in the referrals. That is definitely an unfortunate situation. I'm not too familiar with the exact case that the member opposite has brought forward, but I'm more than happy to take any information from the member to see what we can do to see if we can assist in ensuring that that doesn't happen again, for one, but that individual can get the service they need, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Kings West on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, Carol has worked with massage therapists, chiropractors, physiotherapists, and finally, 4 months ago, broke down and resorted to pain medication. Carol is doing what she can. Her healthcare system, however, is letting her down. Mr. Speaker, I found an interesting quote the other day that couldn't be more appropriate. In 2008, response to the opening of Scotia surgery, current Premier, while leader of the official opposition, stated, and I quote, "I know our public system, given adequate resources and effective direction, can improve wait times from within," and I will table that quote. Scotia surgery, while it can't help Carol, is still providing service. However, wait times for orthopedic surgeries in our province continue to produce failing grades. Could the minister please tell us whether it is inadequate resources or ineffective direction that is causing wait times for orthopedic surgeries to continue to grow?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And we have addressed wait times, and we have seen wait times reduce in the province. Not all of them. I would agree there's a lot of work that needs to be done around the wait times of orthopedic surgeons. We have really high rates, success rates in addressing wait times for those more urgent and serious cases, like cardiac surgery, for example, Mr. Speaker. We in Nova Scotia, Nova Scotians get those surgeries when they need them, as quickly as they need them, Mr. Speaker. We know that orthopedic surgery waits have been less of a priority compared to cardiac surgery. So that's why we recently invested in another additional $2 million to do what we would call an orthopedic blitz, where we tried to tackle anybody over a year wait to try to reduce that list, or that wait list, Mr. Speaker. As we move forward, as the hard work that we've done to get back to balance will allow myself as Minister of Health to look at additional funding towards orthopedic surgery so that we continue to drop those wait lists, Mr. Speaker. We have a number of professionals out into the district health authorities who are working in prehab clinics, for example. We had created one in Pictou, Cape Breton, and the Valley to help reduce the wait times, to help support people on the orthopedic surgery wait times, Mr. Speaker. And we want to work extremely hard to see if we can reduce those numbers into the future. That's why it was so important to get back to balance this year, Mr. Speaker. As we move forward, I hope, and it's my hope, that we can have more funds to address the orthopedic waits that we see in the province.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Energy. On April 18th, Moody's Investor Services assigned a AAA-backed issuing rating for the Muskrat Fall, to Emera for the Muskrat Falls project. The reason for this high-grade rating, Mr. Speaker, is because they said there is no risk to the company in the project. And those companies, of course, being Nova Scotia Power, Emera, and Nalcor. And I will table the Moody's rating. Mr. Speaker, and there's no risk to the companies because, of course, all the risk is going to be borne by Nova Scotia ratepayers on the Maritime Link project. Mr. Speaker, why does the minister feel that eliminating the risk for a very profitable private company such as Emera is a good idea, and shifting it to ratepayers is also a good idea?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Of course, Emera has been around since the 1990s, and as we know, it was the Liberal government of the day that created Emera, so perhaps in the member's research you could get the answer he's looking for there. But today the UARB has the role to determine what is best for the ratepayers of Nova Scotia, and that process is underway with the present hearings, and by this summer we'll have an answer on whether it is the right deal for ratepayers of this province.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's this government that has shifted the risk away from Emera and to Nova Scotia ratepayers. Not any other party, not any other government. You know, Mr. Speaker, there were other options, of course. This project could have moved ahead under a different type of deal where Emera would have taken the risk and any strategic benefits of the undersea connection could still be realized, as found by Synapse, the board's own consultant, and I'll table that. Mr. Speaker, earlier this year, Credit Suisse also gave a high approval rating for the Maritime Link project because, again, Emera assumes no risk. In fact, Credit Suisse gave Emera stock an outperform rating, in part because, quote, electricity transmission-focused endeavours, in particular related to Nalcor projects, in our view are key drivers for the stock in the future. Key drivers, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, why is the NDP so focused on increasing the share price of Emera rather than ensuring the true lowest cost energy alternative for ratepayers, which we now know is a made in Nova Scotia solution?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Of course, made in Nova Scotia, that's what COMFIT is all about. And the COMFIT is the community feed-in tariff that's been very popular in this province, and many municipalities and non-profit groups are looking at that. And green energy is what this government is committed to. Muskrat Falls is certainly an important part of that. But again, the UARB has the role and responsibility to look at all the evidence, including the interveners, including the experts that have testified. It'll be cross-examined. It'll be the evidence will be fully tested, and in the end, the decision will be made by the UARB to determine whether it is the best possible transaction for ratepayers of this province.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Mr. Speaker, this government is so proud of the COMFIT projects that their own study, the Dalton study, as found by the Synapse report that I just tabled, forgot to include their impact when it looked at the Maritime Link project. That's how important they were to this government. You know, Mr. Speaker, this government is so focused on protecting Emera that last year it signed an agreement with the company to not negatively impact it through regulatory charges. And I'll table the Premier's press release. I'm sure most businesses wish the province would have signed such a deal with them, instead of burdening them with $1,400 more higher user fees, a reduced threshold for the small business tax, and ever-increasing power rates. But as always, the NDP sides with Emera and not small business owners. You know, Mr. Speaker, it's so bad that Credit Suisse in the report I tabled just calls the hearings regulatory noise. Mr. Speaker, why is the NDP so focused on increasing profits over one company over the well-being and success of every other small business in the province?
The Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, I've been trying since this spring session has started and before to try to figure out what is the Liberal position on energy. What is it they're really trying to do? I do know, Mr. Speaker, they want to put the HST back on home energy. They want to eliminate efficiency in Nova Scotia. They're talking about deregulating the electricity market. That's a 30 to 50% increase. They want to cozy up to Hydro-Quebec. But, you know, really, I'm trying to determine what is the real Liberal plan here. And I found on the 28th of March, the honourable member from Dartmouth East tabled a document. I guess it's maybe what their Liberal plan is on energy. They had this document. It's a one-pager. I guess it's actually about a two-thirds of a pager. They said the Muskrat Falls, they compared that to their alternate plan. Well, the alternate plan really is, you know, the Liberal plan. It's untitled, this document. It's a lot of typing mistakes in it, but it tells me maybe what the Liberal plan is. But they're putting it forward as their experts, their expertise on energy. And it mentions there's a 0% risk to ratepayers. But I would say, Mr. Speaker, that there's really a 0% chance this is going to succeed. So it's that's what the Liberal energy plan is all about. So I'll table that, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last time the shelter component for income assistance recipients was increased, it was by the former Conservative government in 2006. That's 7 years, Mr. Speaker, and over the past 4 years under the NDP, we've seen no increase, although market rents have steadily climbed. Can the Minister explain to the House why the NDP government continued the trend of no increase in shelter allowances for income assistance recipients?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the honourable member for the question, because I know that he brings this question up the last several years. And so the explanation is still the same, is that we realize that we're going through tough economic times, and we're the first government that have created so many different initiatives that give people multiple opportunities to increase their income. And we have done that through many different means in terms of providing the poverty reduction tax credit, the affordable tax credit. We've increased the child tax benefit. We've also increased the IA rate by $17 a month this time, and that's a total of $47 increase. So there's many items that we have provided for people of Nova Scotia to tap into those particular programs so that they will actually, and have seen actually, an increase in their income levels. Thank you.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, landlords and HRM are awaiting a decision from the Utility and Review Board that will see a potential large increase in their water costs this coming July. With rising energy costs, including electricity, landlords are starting to feel the squeeze, and ultimately, Mr. Speaker, it will be felt by tenants. Jeremy Jackson, President of the Investment Property Owners Association of Nova Scotia, was recently quoted in the Chronicle Herald stating, and I quote, "The challenge that we have is if you think about apartments, oftentimes it's the students, it's the seniors, it's working class, the folks that obviously aren't in high income brackets. They're the ones that are going to take the biggest hit," and I'll table that, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, although the increase in personal allowance in this budget will be seen as beneficial, it is simply in one hand and taken right out by the other when we're looking at potential increases in rent. When will the minister and her government understand that with no shelter increase for income assistance recipients, they will continue to live unhealthy lives and be at risk for potential homelessness?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member opposite knows, we've had many discussions about the challenges of increasing the shelter rate, because in turn what often happens, and history has shown, that the landlords in turn increase the shelter rate. So then it goes exactly in one hand and out of the other hand. So we're trying to prevent that by taking a holistic approach where individuals and families and seniors are actually being boosted up in their income from all these variety of programs that I have talked about. And in fact, with seniors, we have been very focused on helping seniors in terms of those that receive the GIS no longer paying income tax, increasing that amount, along with the land tax rebate, which we've increased twice from a total of $400 right up to $800 since this government's been in as a maximum. There's been many different programs, as I said, and I think what's important to note that by helping families and individuals increase their overall income is a much better solution than providing an increase in shelter rates that one day they'll have in their left hand and the next day they're passing it along to the landlord in their right hand. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, rising electricity costs, rising food costs, and increasing rental rates, along with numerous policy changes and adjustments within the Department of Community Services, has made it more difficult for income assistance recipients to recover from addiction, live day-to-day with mental health issues, and of course, more importantly, Mr. Speaker, move towards becoming employable. Mr. Speaker, with all these challenges that low-income Nova Scotians have faced over the past 4 years, how can they believe that the NDP government has moved forward with the poverty reduction strategy in a positive way?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. There's so much I could talk about with regards to this, and those are such things as I previously mentioned. But if you take the original poverty reduction strategy that was developed in 2009 and do a comparison, you will see that this government has absolutely exceeded any of the objectives and goals that were in that strategy. We've also are developing the first housing strategy in this province that will address some of those issues issues that are being brought forth. We do know that times are tough and there are increases in food prices, and we understand the issues around electricity. That's why we've taken the HST off of home heating that the other two parties opposite would put back on if they were in government. We developed the first mental health strategy. We're entirely changing the internal workings of community services. We're redesigning the income assistance program, and I can go on. And those on the opposite side never, ever looked at even one strategy to develop, and we have multiple strategies, and there's action behind those strategies. And just ask those people that have had an increase in their income level, like a working couple, young couple with 2 children, for example, have now over $2,400 in their pocket annually that would have never occurred with those parties on the opposite side.
The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, as everyone knows, the 2013-14 budget is based on extremely optimistic revenue projections for the province. HST revenue, which is reliant on retail sales and transactions, is estimated to grow by an additional $78.9 million, or almost 5%. But just this week, we've received retail sales figures from Stats Canada that show a far more sombre reality. Nova Scotia had negative retail sales growth in all measures. On a month-over-month, year-to-date, and on a year-over-year basis, retail sales decreased 0.6%, 2.2%, and 1.6%, all three of them decreasing. Mr. Speaker, given these disappointing retail sales results, how can the minister stand and support the inflated HST revenue figures that were included in the budget this year?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I've said here before, Mr. Speaker, the revenue forecast for this year's budget passed last night. Received for the first time in a decade the unqualified opinion of the Auditor General. Mr. Speaker, we're prepared with the consultation process of all of the senior economists in the major financial institutions in the country and other important organizations such as the Conference Board of Canada and APEC. Mr. Speaker, those forecasts, those assumptions were supported as being reasonable assumptions given the progress this government has made and the fact that we are about to turn the corner on 20 years of the worst economic performance under previous governments, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's no turning the corner. There's burying their heads in the sand is what's happening. Mr. Speaker, the revenue projected from HST will be dependent on people working and having disposable income to buy cars, electronics, and everything else. While retail sales are down, next year's projection for employment are also down. It's been projected that there will be 1,100 fewer jobs in Nova Scotia next year, and the budget assumption documents which we were given projects an unemployment rate of 9.2% in 2013 and 14, which is actually higher, in other words, worse than it is today. So with higher unemployment projected for the coming year, the likelihood of any significant increase in HST revenue is very unlikely. Mr. Speaker, given that the budget assumptions document itself does not support the HST revenue estimate in the budget, would the minister commit to tabling in the House the assumptions that were cherry-picked to create this unrealistic revenue projection?
Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the only thing that we see in this House that is cherry-picked is the very select, highly distorted, often factually incorrect information that comes from that party over there, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, You know, last month, Nova Scotia was the only province in the country that added full-time jobs in the economy following a prior month when we had also seen a reversal in the job numbers. Mr. Speaker, we have some fantastic opportunities on the horizon, and the member may have seen the senior economist from APEC speaking at a KPMG conference not so long ago, where she talked about how Nova Scotia has very positive opportunities in front of us that indeed will mean economic growth and job potential in this province. Mr. Speaker, we don't hear the members from the opposition talk about those things. All we hear from the opposition is negativity, is cynicism, Mr. Speaker, and Mr. Speaker, we are the party that will bring prosperity to this province, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government's own assumptions document, which was passed out to every member of the House here, along with the budget information, shows indicators like high unemployment, flat population growth, more part-time work, and more. Those all negative figures. None of these would support a marked increase in HST revenue or in personal income tax revenue. The Canadian Federation of Independent Business Surveys, if we can go to them as well, they regularly survey their members, and their recent findings continue to show a lack of optimism and confidence among business owners. They don't see any significant growth in their staff numbers because they feel unsure about the future. So here again is another indicator, one that shows business confidence, and it doesn't support a projection that would say we're going to get more people working and more personal income tax and more HST. So, Mr. Speaker, can the minister tell the House how she can reconcile the inflated revenue projections with the reality of a cautious and uncertain business climate in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I would think that the honourable member would be aware that while retail sales are very important and, yes, in fact, have a relationship, a bearing on HST revenue, they're certainly not the only driver of HST revenue. And, Mr. Speaker, one of the most significant drivers of HST revenue, in fact, is construction, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Speaker, in the area of construction, once again, Nova Scotia is in very strong position. All you have to do is look around the HRM and you see the construction that is going on, Mr. Speaker. And
30 building cranes, the most in our history.
And, Mr. Speaker, well, the members opposite, they seem to think that it's not good to have construction in the HRM. Well, Mr. Speaker, let me tell you that construction in the HRM and the generation of revenue in this area, the generation of revenue in this area benefits the entire province. It means not only can we balance our budget, it means we can reinvest in things that the Liberal Party cut when they were in government, like the children's dental program, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Public Accounts Committee met on December 5th, 2012, and I heard from witnesses from the Department of Education. Committee members had questions that the witnesses were unable to answer, and those questions were sent in correspondence from the Public Accounts Committee to the Department of Education on December the 19th, and I will table that correspondence. On January 21st, the Deputy Minister acknowledged receipt of the letter and said a response would be, and I quote, forthcoming shortly, and I will table her response. As of March the 12th, the committee had still not received a response, and so a second letter was sent, and I will table that. On April 4th, Mr. Speaker, a third letter was sent to the department, and I will table that. It is now April the 24th, and still no response from the department. We heard concerns yesterday, Mr. Speaker, from all members of the opposition and from the member from Halifax Atlantic that this government is preventing this House from doing its work, and this includes the work of the legislative committees. So my question to the minister is this. Is the failure to respond to the request from the All-Party Committee of Public Accounts due to the fact that the minister and her department do not know the answers, or are they withholding information and impeding the work of this House?
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I will make sure that I will speak to the Deputy Minister to exactly see the train of this. This is the first I'm hearing of this situation, and you know we will make sure that the information will be forthcoming. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Colchester North on her first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, that first correspondence went in December. It is now 4 months. I would expect that the minister might know what's going on in her department. Mr. Speaker, these questions were put to the Public Accounts Committee on behalf of parents and teachers and students. And we know this government has not identified education as a priority. They continue to cut funding from schools for the last 3 years. The minister does not know how many students have special needs. The minister denies that there are nearly 2,000 kids waiting for a wait list for critical assessments. And we know that the department should be able to answer every one of the committee's questions. I would hope that the minister respects the legislative committee structure. Either that, or why will she not give the answers? So, my question to the minister, why has there been no response to the committee's requests that were submitted 4 months ago?
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As I said in my first answer, that I definitely will be reacting to this and making sure that the information is forthcoming. I also want to make it very, very clear that this government has a priority as for our education system. We have brought in a plan with Kids and Learning First. We are making sure that our youngest children in our province are supporting with literacy, with succeeding in reading. We're making sure that our children are getting the appropriate math with our math program that's going to be moving forward. This is a government that has moved forward, and Mr. Speaker, we are making sure that we have education as a priority, and as I said, I will look into this situation and I will be back to the honourable member as soon as I can.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Natural Resources. Port Hawkesbury paper is in an industry that's highly stressed. Paper products are not used as much as they once were, and although we do hear good reports about the mill, that it's achieving success with sales orders, we do know that the industry is stressed. And now that the mill is up and running, wood suppliers are one of the costs for the mill. And they are now under stress as well, because they're called upon to provide wood to the mill at a very competitive price so the mill can sell paper at a competitive price. So my question to the minister, will the minister meet with these suppliers and hear their recommendations and work with them to ensure that they have a future to keep supplying the mill?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and certainly I thank the opportunity for the member to, I guess, maybe continue our dialogue that we had in the estimate. So it sounds very similar to what we had previously discussed. But as we know, when there was challenges there in that mill, our Premier stepped up and immediately met with the workers and their families and the businesses in the area, and the Forestry Infrastructure Fund was put in place, as well as the Hot Idle Initiative, and kept that mill alive and kept the opportunity to create good jobs, 1,400 good jobs in the community. And some of those are in the woods, in the contracting, and woods operators and truckers and silviculture contractors and so on. So we certainly had a full commitment to Port Hawkesbury, to Cape Breton and eastern Nova Scotia, and we continue to do that. And I would be pleased at any time to meet with the forestry workers or their representatives to see in what way we can continue the dialogue.
The honourable member for Inverness on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the Minister for his gracious offer. Mr. Speaker, I'm thinking of a couple of things here. Silviculture rates for wood contractors have not changed for the past 15 years. Now, before the members opposite say, well, the previous government should have done something about that, we are where we are. And this represents, I want to say that silviculture represents a needed revenue stream for some of these wood suppliers. They don't just cut wood, they also go out into the forests and make sure that the forests rejuvenate. So will the minister review these rates and recognize that it costs more to do silviculture work today than it did 15 years ago?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And we know the value of the forest industry to this province. Certainly, and as it indicated in the earlier response, we kept the forest industry alive through the troubling period they had, and now with the new operator, things are once again on much more stable ground. The silviculture rates, I understand, are under review. We're looking at that, and we will continue to work with the stakeholders in the industry. And of course, prices depend on supply and demand. You know, the market conditions, certainly with the two large pulp mills in eastern and central region of the province, there is some competition, and that's a good thing for the private woodlot owner.
The honourable member for Inverness on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, another issue that's been raised is the amount of wood that's being purchased from New Brunswick. And of course, when wood is purchased out of province, we don't have the same silviculture fees going back into our province. So that's affecting these suppliers as well. But I do know that part of the agreement with Port Hawkesbury Paper is that they are to buy 200,000 tonnes of pulpwood from private Nova Scotia suppliers each year. Can the minister assure us all that those targets are look like they're going to be hit this year in terms of the amount of woods purchased from Nova Scotia suppliers? And could he provide that information by tabling it here in the legislature? Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And initially, when the mill started up last September, there was a contract to provide 200,000 tonnes from private woodlot owners, and there were some challenges in meeting that in the first 3 months. But so there's a small amount of wood, I understand, that was purchased from New Brunswick. But since that time, there's been no wood purchased from out of province. And so 200,000 tonnes was the quota out of the 600,000 tonnes, so a third was the commitment to private woodlot owners. My understanding now that arrangements have been made with various sawmillers and private woodlot cooperatives and owners, and actually it's almost half. It's actually 48% of the wood is now being purchased from private woodlot owners in eastern Nova Scotia.
The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister responsible for immigration. Mr. Speaker, it's been said that the community identified stream provides rural communities with their best opportunity to get the economic benefits of immigration. In 2011, the number of nominee certificates under that community identified stream was 146. And that means 146 families that went to rural parts of the province. The success of the stream is solely attributable to the former RDAs. Their hard work ensured the benefits of immigration were spread across the province and not centralized just in the urban core. My question to the Minister, now that the province is transitioning away from RDAs, could the Minister please tell us who is responsible for ensuring the success of the community-identified stream?
The Honourable Minister responsible for immigration.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, you know, at the end of the day, it's the Office of Immigration, and to a point, I like the encouragement from across the way. It's the federal government. But, Mr. Speaker, we will continue to work with RENs when they develop and work with them as champions for rural Nova Scotia, especially as it relates to immigration issues, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park on her first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not very happy with that answer because there's a gap in our system for immigration to rural areas. I hope the Minister will look into this. Mr. Speaker, I hope the minister will be looking into this. The RDAs provided not only the identification of community people that could come to immigrate to their areas, they also provided the newcomer navigators and support that help people stay in those areas. So it was a very important part of immigration to rural Nova Scotia. The provincial nominee stream and the work done in communities throughout the province helps all rural communities. So while the rural enterprise networks, which are supposed to replace RDAs, are going to have a new mandate and focus, it's important that we don't lose the focus on immigration in rural areas. That's important. My final question to the minister is, will regional enterprise networks be mandated to identify immigrants under the community identified stream, or will this government just hope for the best when it comes to the future success of attracting immigrants to rural Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister responsible for immigration.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't, again, the theme of today is what part of yes don't they understand, Mr. Speaker? We've been working for this. You know, that we will work with the RDAs, and I know the member from Glace Bay wants me to talk for a minute and a half. But no, because it wouldn't be fair, because I'm sure that the member has another supplementary, Mr. Speaker. But the thing is, we are working with these groups, and it is community focused. We understand that, and we were working with these groups. It's not as they would portray it. It is a fact, Mr. Speaker, that we're working with all individuals in all communities to grow our immigration.
The Honourable Member for Halifax-Clayton Park on her final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, however you felt about the provision of regional development services for economic development, it's important that the government recognize immigration was part of the service. That's what's important, and that's what's being missed. Mr. Speaker, it's very important that the government replace that service on the ground in rural Nova Scotia. That's the purpose of my question today. On the ground. Mr. Speaker, the minister has not provided an answer about who's going to provide the service in the absence of the RDA. So I don't mind asking him with 10 seconds to go. Maybe he can provide me a written answer or an answer to the House. It's important to many members in this House who's going to be the point of contact for community-identified immigrants in rural Nova Scotia.
Order, please. The time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers have expired. I will now recognize the House Leader for the official opposition.
Mr. Speaker, would you please call Bill number 34?
Bill number 34. The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it gives me pleasure to rise on Bill number 34, the Ratepayers Protection Act. And astute watchers of the legislature will note that this bill is slightly different than the last version because, of course, after a year of arguing against it, the NDP government actually finally adopted one of the parts of this bill, which was removing the bonuses from executive salaries, which was included in the original version of this bill. And of course, we all remember the government spent over a year saying it wasn't necessary and was a bad idea,